in the heart of the ancient world, where rivers met and civilizations blossomed. There stood the majestic city of Baghdad, place of learning, trade, and beauty. Its golden domes reflected the light of the sun like polished mirrors, and its narrow streets bustled with life merchants calling out price as children, laughing in alleyways, and the scent of spices, bread, and ink wafting through the air like a soft melody. But amid this vibrant city was a quieter story, one not written in grand libraries or etched into palaces, but carried gently in the heart of a humble boy whose name was Idris. Idris was no prince, nor was he the son of a noble. He was the child of a cloth seller who had passed away when Idris was just a small boy. Raised by his mother in a modest home near the outer markets, Idris grew up with very little in his pocket, but something far more precious in his heart: truthfulness, a love for fairness, and a soul deeply rooted in tawakkul, trust in Allah's plan. His mother, a woman of deep faith, would often whisper to him after Fajr prayer, "My son, never let the world blind you from what is right. Rizq comes from Allah, not from dishonesty. Speak the truth, even if it costs you silver and gold." By the age of 14, Idris had begun helping in the bazaar, selling small goods for other merchants, carrying baskets of dried figs, or folding bolts of cloth at dusk. He watched how some traders would sweeten their tongue with customers only to cheat them moments later. Others would weigh less on the scale, add dust to their spices, or charge double to those who didn't know better. But Idris could not bring himself to do the same. Even when given a chance to cut corners, he would quietly step away. One chilly morning, when the mist still lingered above the Tigris River, Idris stood outside the shop of a leather merchant. He was dressed simply in a woolen thobe patched at the elbow and sandals whose soles had thinned with time. Yet in his eyes shone a light that couldn't be hidden. That morning, as traders began to open their stalls, the leather merchant stepped outside and handed Idris a small pouch of coins and said, "Take this, lad. Go purchase fresh goat hides from the southern tanner. But be quick, others will buy them by midday." The merchant trusted Idris for his punctuality and silence. What he didn't know, however, was that this small errand would mark the beginning of a story that the people of Baghdad would tell for generations. As Idris walked through the busy streets, he noticed an elderly man struggling to lift his sack near the well. Without a second thought, Idris paused and helped him gently, though it cost him time. Then, while passing through the dye market, he found a child crying, lost and alone, and took him by the hand to find his mother. Again, he did not think of delay or coins or business. He thought only of khidmah, of serving, as his mother had taught him. When he finally reached the southern end of the city, the sun was already climbing higher, and a few other merchants had begun purchasing hides. Atana looked up and said, "You're late, boy. Only 5 hides remain." Idris handed him the pouch and said, "Buy only what is fair. Count it twice. I do not want to take what doesn't belong to me." The tanner weighed the hides, calculated the price, and returned a few coins. But when Idris checked the amount quietly, he realized the tanner had mistakenly given him 1 dinar extra. He stood silently for a moment. No one had seen it. The streets were loud. He could have kept it, and no one would have known. But he remembered his mother's words, "Honesty is its own reward, and Allah sees when no one else does." He turned back, offered the dinar with a soft smile, and said, "Sir, you overpaid me. Please take what is yours." The tanner stared, stunned. "Are you sure?" he asked, eyeing the coin. Most would have walked away. Idris only replied, "It is not mine to keep. Barakah does not come from lies." That day, the tanner was so moved by the boy's truthfulness that he followed him all the way back to the bazaar and told the leather merchant everything. From that moment on, a quiet whisper began to spread through the lanes of Baghdad, not about a great warrior or wealthy prince, but about a boy with bright eyes and a heart that would not bend before gold. The morning after his quiet act of honesty, Idris returned to the market unaware of the small ripple his choice had caused. He walked barefoot across the smooth, warm stones of the marketplace, humming a gentle melody his mother used to sing while kneading bread. The scent of cinnamon and cardamom drifted from nearby stalls, and the city of Baghdad, as always, pulsed with the gentle rhythm of trade, prayer, and life. Yet something felt different today. Traders he had passed for years now paused to nod politely, a few even offering soft greetings. Word had spread not loudly, not boastfully, but like a pleasant breeze slipping through the curtains of every honest heart. The leather merchant, whose name was Hamid, awaited him at the stall with an unusual calmness. "Idris," he said, while stroking his beard, "come, sit beside me today. Let us talk like men do." Idris obeyed with quiet respect, his hands folded in his lap, still unsure of what had brought this change. Hamid stared at the boy for a long moment before speaking again. "Yesterday, the tanner came to me, told me of your deed. He said you returned a dinar to him, though you could have kept it and gone unnoticed. That single moment told me more about you than all the years you've helped me." Idris lowered his gaze and replied gently, "I only did what was right. My mother taught me that honesty is part of faith. It is not mine to boast about." Hamid smiled. "Then I will test this honesty, if you allow me." From beneath the counter, he pulled out a small wooden chest, old but polished, and unlocked it with a silver key. Inside were a series of pouches, each filled with coins, documents, and written orders. "I want you to manage this stall today, on your own. We'll see how you handle the dealings, the weight, the words, and the wealth." Idris hesitated, surprised by the offer, but accepted it with gratitude. Not because he craved power or gold, because he knew this was a trust, and trust must be honored. The day unfolded like never before. One by one, customers arrived, some honest, others sly. One man tried to barter down a price using flattery, while another attempted to confuse Idris about the measure of the leather. But Idris, though young, stayed firm and kind. He weighed every item carefully, offered fair prices, and spoke with the quiet dignity that can only come from someone who fears no one but Allah. Even when a nobleman in fine robes offered him extra to cheat the weight in his favor, Idris refused, saying softly, "I cannot sell my akira for your dunya." By late afternoon, Hamid returned and found the stall still in perfect order. The coins had been counted with precision, the books balanced with clarity. More than that, several new customers had expressed a desire to return, not because of low prices, but because of the peace they felt in dealing with the boy. One elderly woman even said, "In his presence, my heart felt calm." Like he was not just selling, but serving with sincerity. Hamid placed his hand on Idris's shoulder and said, "You have passed a test that many grown men fail. This stall, these goods, they will be yours to manage from now on. You are not a helper anymore, Idris. You are a merchant." But Idris simply bowed his head and whispered, "All praise belongs to Allah, who sees all hearts and blesses those who trust him." And so, under the golden skies of Baghdad, with the call to Asr echoing across the rooftops, the boy who once carried baskets now carried trust. His name would soon become known, not through shouts or signs, but through quiet stories told between merchants, whispered from mother to child, and written gently into the city's soul. As the weeks passed, Idris became more than just a merchant in Baghdad's bustling heart. He became a quiet example. His stall was never the grandest, nor the most decorated, but something about it drew people in. Perhaps it was the soft way he greeted everyone, young or old, rich or poor, with a peaceful smile and a hand over his chest. Or perhaps it was the honesty that flowed from his eyes, like a clear spring, untouched and pure. He never shouted to sell his wares, never exaggerated a claim. Yet the line at his stall seemed to grow longer with each passing day. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and the lanterns along the street began to flicker to life, glowing like soft stars grounded to earth, an old man approached the stall. His robe was worn, stitched with care, and his walking stick tapped gently against the stones. His eyes held years of stories, and when he spoke, his voice carried both weight and wisdom. "Peace be upon you, young one," the man said. "And upon you peace, uncle," Idris replied, helping him sit on a small cushion he always kept for elders. "I have traveled from Basra," the man continued, "and I have heard your name whispered, not with fame, but with respect. I came to see if the stories were true." Idris blushed and bowed his head. "I am but a servant of Allah. I try only to trade with truth." The old man smiled and placed a small leather purse on the counter. "This belongs to you now," he said. Idris's brow furrowed. "But I have not sold you anything yet." "No," the man said softly. "But many years ago, when I was a younger merchant, I too once made a choice. I returned something precious to a traveler who had dropped it unknowingly. That man blessed me with more than just gratitude. He told me that one day, when I saw a soul that shone with that same light, I should pass on what he had once given me." He gently unwrapped the pouch to reveal not gold, but a small sealed scroll and a ring of green and gold. The scroll read, "For the one who holds truth above trade, who walks with trust above wealth, and who seeks Allah in every exchange. This gift is not payment, but a prayer passed forward." Idris was moved. He looked at the old man with wonder. "Why me?" "Because your deeds speak before your tongue does," the man replied. "And Baghdad needs more souls like yours." That night, under the soft glow of his oil lamp, Idris unrolled a cloth and placed the scroll and ring inside, not for display, but for remembrance. A reminder that honesty was not a small act. It was a chain of goodness, passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. The city of Baghdad, with all its noise and color, never noticed the quiet ripples this moment created. But in homes where mothers rocked their babies and fathers spoke of honor, Idris's name was added to stories not of heroes with swords, but heroes with truth in their hearts. A few days after the meeting with the old traveler, the skies above Baghdad began to shift. What was once a golden afternoon turned slowly into a cloudy curtain of gray. The air smelled of rain and distant earth, and a hush fell over the usually noisy bazaar. The stallholders rushed to tie down their cloth shades to protect their goods from what they knew would be no ordinary drizzle. The storm, it seemed, was not just of wind and water, but a test of patience, and perhaps, for some, a test of character. Idris remained at his stall. He had covered his baskets of dates, figs, and herbs with linen, weighted down with stones. As the first drops began to fall, light and slow like whispered words, most merchants had already locked their coin boxes and closed up. But Idris remained seated on his small wooden bench, his hands folded, calmly watching the sky as if listening for Allah's wisdom in every raindrop. Then, in the flurry of hurried footsteps and slamming shutters, a man came rushing past, dressed finely, with rings on his fingers and a satchel flung over his shoulder. In his panic, the satchel slipped and fell near Idris's stall. The man didn't notice. He vanished into the curtain of rain. Idris stood up, carefully picked up the satchel, and took it under his awning. The leather was smooth and new, clearly from a wealthy household. Inside were neatly folded papers, property deeds, ledgers, and coins wrapped in cloth. Idris did not count the coins, nor peek further. He simply placed the satchel in his wooden chest, the same one where he kept his prayer mat and leftover bread. The next day, the sun returned. The marketplace opened like a blooming flower after rain. Colors returned to the awnings. The scent of cardamom and roasted almonds filled the air, and voices lifted once more in cheerful bargaining. Just after door prayer, the wealthy man returned, this time on foot, his shoes muddy, his face pale. "Has anyone seen a leather satchel?" he called out. "It was lost near this place yesterday." Some merchants shook their heads. Others looked away, either unsure or uninterested, but Idris stood up, stepped forward, and said calmly, "Describe it." The man blinked. "Dark brown leather, a golden clasp. My initials stitched inside." Idris nodded and brought it out. Allah returned this to you through me, he said, gently placing it in the man's hands. The merchant opened the bag in disbelief. Everything was intact. He looked up, tears misting his eyes. You didn't take anything. I only keep what is mine, Idris replied. And honesty is worth more to me than coins. That single moment traveled across the marketplace like fire through dry grass. By sunset, people came to his stall not just for goods, but for advice, for blessings, for the peace they found in his presence. Even children began to mimic him, sitting cross-legged beside their mothers, pretending to sell figs and whispering, "I only keep what is mine." And far beyond the walls of that bazaar, even in the courtyards of the rich, people spoke of the young merchant with clean hands and a clean heart, a man who stayed steady in storms, not only of weather, but of temptation. As the story of Idris's honesty continued to ripple through Baghdad, it eventually reached the ears of someone whose attention could change the life of any common man, the Grand Vizier of the Caliph himself. The Vizier, a man known for his deep intelligence and careful scrutiny of character, had grown weary of false merchants and dishonest dealings. He longed to see sincerity again in the hearts of his people, especially the youth. And when he heard of a young trader in the marketplace who returned a wealthy man as satchel without even counting the gold inside, he was intrigued and moved. One golden morning, not long after Fajr prayer, Idris arrived at his stall to find 2 royal guards standing beside it. They did not speak roughly, nor carry the air of authority that usually frightened the common folk. Instead, they bowed respectfully and handed him a scroll sealed with the Caliph's own emblem. Idris's heart pounded as he broke the wax and unrolled the parchment. It was an invitation, not a summons, but a humble request. The Grand Vizier desired to meet him in the palace gardens the following day, just after the Dhuhr prayer. The rest of the day passed slowly. Word spread again, and the bazaar buzzed with curiosity. Some congratulated Idris warmly, saying, "Your honesty has raised you higher than the tallest minarets." Others, a little jealous, whispered, "Let us see how long the young merchant remains humble now." But Idris smiled, as he always did, neither proud nor shaken. He simply packed his herbs, swept the dust from his mat, and made his way home as the sun dipped below the Tigris River. That night, Idris couldn't sleep easily. He thought of what the vizier might want. Was it reward? Was it advice? Was it a test? He whispered dua softly into the quiet air, asking Allah for clarity, for humility, and for the courage to remain honest no matter where life took him, even if it was behind palace gates. The next day, the palace loomed before him, not in an intimidating way, but like a page in a storybook come to life. The marble walls shone under the midday sun, and peacocks strutted in the gardens where the vizier waited beneath the shade of an olive tree. The vizier was older than Idris expected, with kind eyes and a beard that showed streaks of silver. He did not greet Idris as a superior would greet a peasant. Instead, he stood and placed a hand on Idris's shoulder. "You remind me," the vizier said softly, "of how this city once was, a place where trade did not come before truth." They walked through the garden together, speaking not of gold, but of values, of what it meant to be trusted in a world that had forgotten the meaning of trust. The vizier asked nothing of him, yet offered him everything: a position in the Palace Trade Council, lands, influence. But Idris, ever calm, bowed and replied, "I am honored beyond words, but I find peace behind my small stall in the market. If I can be of help to you or the Caliph, I will serve, but my heart remains with the people." The vizier smiled deeply. "Then that is where you shall serve, among them as their example." And so Idris returned to his stall, not as a servant of royalty, but as a servant of truth, his place unchanged, yet respected even more. The people did not call him merchant anymore. They called him Alamin, the trustworthy. Though the garden meeting with the Grand Vizier had been brief, its effects were long-lasting. Word had spread across not only Baghdad, but even the outer provinces. The tale of the young, honest merchant named Idris, who turned down wealth and power for the simplicity of a truthful life. For some, his story was a reminder of virtue. For others, it was a challenge to their own pride. But for a few, it stirred something darker: envy. One afternoon, as the air grew heavy with the scent of dates and the streets shimmered under the sun's golden rays, an unfamiliar traveler entered the marketplace. He was dressed in fine silks, his robes glinting with threads of gold. His manner was refined, and his tongue was smooth, yet behind his smile lay hidden motives. This man, known to few by his true name, was actually a wealthy merchant from a rival city who had lost many customers after the fame of Idris spread. Jealous of the youth's honor, he arrived in Baghdad with a plan: not to confront Idris with swords or threats, but with something far more dangerous: temptation. He approached Idris' stall with the poise of nobility and introduced himself as Nasir from Basra. Pretending to be a traveler in need, he praised the honesty of the merchant and admired the simplicity of his stall. "I have heard much about you, young man," he said with a graceful bow. "The people sing your name from rooftops. They say you cannot be bought. I admire such a reputation, but I wonder, have you ever been truly tested?" Idris raised his gaze gently and said, "A man's test comes not from what others offer, but from how he guards his soul when no one is watching." Nasir smiled, but said nothing. He purchased a few herbs and left. The next day he returned, this time with servants carrying a chest, its weight obvious by the strain on their arms. "I have a proposal," he said, lifting the lid to reveal gold coins, shimmering jewelry, and a rare pearl the size of a plum. "All of this is yours, not as a bribe, but as an investment. I want to use your name in my business. Let us say Idris the honest now trades with Nasir the wealthy. We will sell more than ever. You need only give your name. The people trust you. Why not let your honesty serve your future?" The people nearby fell silent, their ears hungry for Idris's reply. A merchant next to him whispered, "Take it, brother. What harm is in allowing your name to grow?" But Idris's heart was not stirred by the shine of gold. He looked at the chest, then at Nasir, and finally at the people gathered around him. "If I sell my name," he said softly, "what value would remain in it? Trust is not a coin to be spent. It is a gift from Allah, to be protected with every breath. If I let it serve falsehood once, it becomes false forever." Nasir's face tightened, his pride bruised. Without another word, he closed the chest and walked away, humiliated not by insult, but by purity. That night, Idris sat by the Tigris, his feet dipped in its cool waters. He did not feel powerful. He did not feel superior. He felt small, but at peace. For he had faced temptation not with anger, but with patience, not with pride, but with sincerity. In a world of glittering distractions, Idris remained a quiet flame, small, gentle, yet unshaken by the winds of false promises. The days following Idris's visit to the House of Wisdom unfolded with a strange calm. Yet something in the air felt different. The markets were as lively as ever, full of camel bells, the sizzling of roasted nuts, and the rhythmic call to prayer. But Idris noticed more people watching him as he passed. Some greeted him with newfound respect. Others whispered and nodded in quiet admiration. The title, "The Honest Merchant," began to float gently from tongue to tongue, though Idris himself still felt like the same young man selling soap and dried figs under a worn canopy. One chilly morning, just before the sun had fully warmed the earth, a man appeared at his stall. He was cloaked in plain desert cloth, with only his eyes visible, and his camel waited behind him. Unusually tall, its saddle lined with silk. The man did not speak at first. He simply observed. His gaze was steady, not threatening, but not casual either. After a few moments, he placed a single object on the wooden stall, a small wooden box with brass hinges. "I want to store this with you. the man said calmly. For 7 days, do not open it. Do not move it. Guard it as if your own soul were inside. I will return. Idris raised his eyes slightly. There are many with safes and locks who offer such services. Why come to a spice cellar with no walls? Because the people trust your hands more than their locks, the stranger replied. And I trust what the people trust. Without another word, he turned, mounted his camel, and disappeared into the morning mist. The box sat on Idris's shelf for 7 days. Customers came and went, coins exchanged hands. But the box remained untouched, a silent reminder that sometimes the greatest test isn't in what you do, but what you resist doing. But the real test came on the 5th night. The wind howled with force that evening. It was the kind of night that made oil lamps flicker and old doors creak. As Idris was closing up, 2 men approached in haste, dressed like foreign travelers. Their accents were rough, and their clothes bore the dust of long roads. We've come for the box, the taller one said. It belongs to our master, and he sent us early. Idris hesitated. Your master said he would return on the 7th day. This is only the 5th. The second man stepped forward, voice sharper. He was delayed. He trusts us. You may give it to us now. But Idris shook his head. Trust is earned face to face. I was entrusted with it under specific terms, and only the one who gave it may take it. The men grew impatient. One offered gold, then more. The other threatened to speak to the city guard. But Idris remained firm, though his heart beat hard. They left in anger, muttering as they vanished into the dark alleys. On the 7th day, just as promised, the original man returned. Silent, steady, and with the same calm presence, Kreese offered the box with both hands, untouched, sealed, unmoved. The man opened the box right there at the stall. Inside was not treasure, but a simple scroll. He unrolled it carefully, then smiled as if reading something he already knew. He looked up at Idris and spoke, this time with warmth. You've passed a test that many fail, he said. It was not about gold or goods. It was about patience, promise, and restraint. He revealed then that he was no ordinary traveler, but a judge from Basra who had come to test the honesty of merchants in the capital. Many had failed before. Idris had not. As the sun began to rise behind the date palms and the minarets called out to prayer, Idris felt no pride, only peace. He had done what was right, not to impress, but because it was in his heart. And once again, the lantern of honesty glowed a little brighter in the old city of Baghdad. As the judge's camel disappeared into the horizon, Idris stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool Baghdad morning. The events of the past few days played softly in his mind. The scroll, the test, the attempted deception by strangers, and the quiet words of the judge that lingered like a blessing. You've asked a test that many fail. But Idris, in his heart, didn't feel victorious. He felt humbled. The market resumed its usual pace. Children ran barefoot with baskets of dates. A baker slapped dough into his stone oven. And the scent of cardamom and cinnamon danced on the breeze. Yet something had changed. Not in the market, but in the way people now looked at the young merchant. They didn't just see a seller of soap and spices. They saw a man of trust, a man who could guard secrets, gold, or scrolls. But most of all, a man who guarded his soul. One afternoon, an old scholar from the House of Wisdom came to him again. He did not come for goods. He brought a gift, a beautiful oil lamp carved with Arabic calligraphy, words from the Quran inscribed on its bronze body. He placed it gently on Idris's table. "This is for your stall," he said with a warm smile. "Let this lamp remind others of the light of honesty that never fades." Idris took it with both hands, kissing it out of respect. He placed the lamp at the corner of his stall, and from that day forward, it never went unlit during his hours of work. It wasn't just a source of light. It was a symbol, a quiet promise that those who dealt with him would never be cheated, tricked, or misled. Years passed, and Idris grew older. His stall became a proper shop, then 2, then 3. He employed young boys to work under him, but only those who were kind, humble, and eager to learn, not just trade, but values. He often told them, while weighing figs or folding cloth, in every coin you earn, there must be honesty. If there isn't, that coin is heavier than gold in this world, and heavier than mountains in the next. The people of Baghdad began to call him Idris al-Amin, Idris the Trustworthy, echoing the title once lovingly given to the Prophet Muhammad himself. It was not a title Idris ever claimed, but he wore it with humility, always remembering that even the greatest trust begins with small choices, made quietly when no one is watching. And so, the story of a young merchant in Baghdad who chose truth over temptation, who held fast to honesty even when gold was offered and threats were made, lived on long after he left this world. Parents told their children about him. Traders told his story in distant lands. And in the bustling heart of old Baghdad, under the soft glow of an oil lamp, his legacy of trust still flickered gently, like a lantern that never dimmed. In the quiet village of Al-Qadim, nestled between hills where the olive trees stood tall and the wind sang through their branches, there lived a boy named Harith. He was no older than 10, with wide, wondering eyes and clothes that had long since been mended by kind neighbors. Harith was an orphan. His father had been a humble date seller who passed away during a harsh winter, and his mother, who once hummed lullabies while grinding wheat, had joined her husband not long after. Left alone in a small clay home on the edge of the village, Harith grew up not in bitterness, but in silence. A silence filled with dreams, questions, and a deep hunger to understand the world. While the other boys ran through the fields or helped their fathers in trade, Harith would sit for hours beneath a great olive tree just outside the masjid, holding scraps of paper he'd found in the wind or discarded pages that had fallen from travelers' journals. He couldn't read them at first, but he studied the shapes of the letters as if they were keys to a door he desperately wanted to open. Often when the village imam came to recite Quran in the courtyard, Harith would quietly sit near the back, soaking in every word, like rain in the desert. He never interrupted, never asked for attention. Yet the elder imam noticed. One evening, as the call to Maghrib echoed through the village and the sky turned a soft gold, the imam approached the boy under the olive tree. "Harith," he said gently, "why do you sit here each day?" Harith looked up shyly and replied, "Because the words you read, they feel like light, and I have nothing in my house that glows." The imam's eyes softened with emotion. Here was a boy with nothing, no parents, no wealth, no formal teacher, yet he carried a flame in his chest that no hardship had extinguished. That night, the imam made a quiet decision. From the next day on, Harith would sit in the front row of the masjid during lessons. The imam brought him an old wooden tablet, a reed pen, and a small piece of inkstone. He taught him the Arabic letters, then simple verses of Quran, and slowly, word by word, Harith learned to read. He memorized faster than boys twice his age, and with each verse he learned. He wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming beauty of the meaning. Harith didn't seek knowledge for pride or praise. He sought it like a thirsty man seeks water. And in the dim light of the masjid, surrounded by the scent of old books and the soft creak of wooden shelves, something miraculous began to take root. A poor orphan boy who once sat alone beneath an olive tree had stepped onto the path of knowledge, not as a student of privilege, but as a seeker of truth, whose heart had always known that learning was a form of worship. Part 2. Ink-stained fingers and sleepless nights as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The village of Al-Qadim quietly bore witness to a transformation that few could have imagined. Harith, once the silent boy who lingered beneath the olive tree, had become a constant presence in the masjid, his eyes alight with a thirst that only the ink of knowledge could quench. The imam, who had once hesitated to burden the child with heavy texts, soon realized that Harith needed no easing into the ocean of learning. He had dived headfirst, his tiny hands clutching every word, every verse, every drop of meaning like a man starved for years. Harith's fingers were soon stained with ink-black smudges under his nails and across the pads of his thumbs, the marks of long nights spent copying Quranic verses, hadith, and wise sayings of scholars on slates of wood and scraps of discarded parchment. He had only one tunic to wear and often walked barefoot across the hot village dust. But inside the masjid, he stood among the pages of sacred texts like a prince among treasures. He did not ask for more than what he had: no new clothing, no bedding, no food beyond what a kind neighbor or the imam offered. His true hunger was not of the belly, but of the heart and mind. Late into the night, when others slept and the village grew still, Harith would remain awake under a flickering oil lamp inside the masjid's corner, his soft voice whispering verses under his breath as he memorized line after line. Sleep did not come easily to him, not because of discomfort, but because the pages called to him. They spoke of prophets and wise men, of justice and mercy, of courage and patience. Each story etched into his soul, forming the pillars of his character. He came to see knowledge not as words on a page, but as a map to a better self, one built upon sincerity, humility, and faith. His eyes would often grow red with exhaustion, but he never complained. When asked if he was tired, Harith would simply smile and say, "The soul rests in remembrance. My body can wait." The imam, moved by this devotion, began to bring Harith rarer text copies of Imam al-Ghazali's writings, the sayings of Imam Malik, and the wisdom of early jurists and scholars. Though the words were complex, Harith devoured them like dates after a fast, slowly savoring each idea and concept, repeating it aloud, until it nestled itself into his memory. Other children sometimes mocked him, gently calling him the masjid mouse or the ink boy, but Harith never responded in anger. In fact, he often helped them with their lessons, correcting their tajweed, helping them form letters properly, and reminding them with kindness when they lost focus. His humility became his shield, and his character, molded by the teachings of the Prophet, was already shining brighter than many older men in the village. What truly made Harith's journey remarkable was not just his talent, but his intention. He wasn't chasing fame or reward. He studied for the sake of pleasing Allah, believing that knowledge was a form of worship, a light in dark times, a path to healing hearts his own, and eventually others. In those quiet hours of the night, as he whispered verses to the rhythm of crickets and watched the lamp's flame dance on the stone walls, was already becoming something extraordinary. An orphan, yes, but also a boy destined to carry the legacy of scholars before him, fueled not by gold or guidance from kings, but by purity, patience, and the silent, powerful determination of someone who believed that knowledge was more precious than the world and all it contained. Seasons passed in the village of Al-Qadim, and with them came the turning of leaves, the slow changes in wind, and the ever-growing strength of young Harith's heart and mind. By now, the people of the village had begun to speak his name with quiet reverence. They no longer saw him as just an orphan, but as a boy of unusual light, not the fire of pride or ambition, but the soft, steady glow of sincerity and humility. And just when it seemed his journey was reaching its peak within the boundaries of his small village, Allah sent him a new chapter, wrapped in the robes of a tired traveler. One afternoon, a stranger arrived at the masjid, an elderly man with a long white beard, leaning on a wooden staff, his robes worn from journey after journey. His name was Sheikh Yunus, a well-traveled scholar known across regions for his wisdom and knowledge of hadith and fiqh. He had heard of the quiet village that held a boy with the heart of a seeker, and though his age burdened his limbs, his spirit longed to meet the one spoken of in distant towns. Harith greeted him with simple words, bowed his head in respect, and offered him a place to sit, serving him water with both hands, one of the old ways of showing adab. Sheikh Yunus stayed for several days, watching Harith from a distance before ever testing his knowledge. He observed his manners, his patience with children, his respect for elders, and the way he never answered with arrogance, even when he knew more than those who questioned him. Then, one morning, he called Harith forward, handed him a parchment of complex rulings and hadith, and said, "Read, explain, and reflect." Harith held the parchment with trembling fingers. His voice was calm, but inside he felt a storm of humility and awe. He read aloud, explained what he knew and where he didn't. He humbly said, Allah knows best." This pleased the old sheikh deeply. Knowledge, after all, is not merely about memorizing words, but knowing when to speak and when to bow in silence before the ocean of what one does not yet understand. In the following days, Sheikh Yunus became Harith's teacher. He taught not just from books, but from life. He told him, knowledge is not the crown of the loud. It is the companion of the sincere. Together, they would walk after Fajr, discussing the etiquettes of the scholars before them. The nights they stayed awake in prayer. The journeys they took with no food except trust in Allah, and the tears they shed when they feared their knowledge would lead them to arrogance. But the greatest test was yet to come. One day, Sheikh Yunus offered Harith a choice. "Come with me," he said gently, "and I will take you to places where knowledge flows like rivers, to Damascus, to Basra, to the courts of great scholars. But it will not be easy. You may go hungry, you may be mocked, you may be forgotten, or you may stay here and teach in peace." Harith looked around the masjid where his journey had begun, the walls that had witnessed his tears, the floor that had cradled his sleep, the imam who had been his first guide. Then he looked toward the road. It was long, dusty, and uncertain. But in his heart he remembered the story of the prophet Musa, who journeyed far for knowledge. With quiet courage, he replied, "If it pleases Allah and you believe, I am ready. Then I will walk where the truth takes me." And so, with nothing but a satchel of books, a heart full of trust, and the blessings of his village behind him, Harith stepped out, not as a poor orphan, but as a student of sacred knowledge. Walking the path of the scholars, the road stretched out before Harith like a ribbon woven by fate, long, dusty, and silent except for the sound of footsteps and whispers of wind that passed through trees like gentle prayers, as he and Sheikh Yunus began their journey toward Basra. Harith carried little with him: a small cloth bag with bread, a leather-bound copy of the Quran, a few precious pages of hadith notes, and most importantly, a heart overflowing with gratitude and trust in Allah. Days melted into nights as they walked through towns, valleys, and narrow paths, sleeping in masjids, resting under trees, or finding comfort near the humble hearths of kind strangers. Harith quickly learned that the journey to seek knowledge was not only about books and lectures. It was also about patience, hardship, and learning from every soul they encountered. In one village, they met a blind man who recited Quran so beautifully that people came from miles just to listen. "I may not see," he told Harith, "but I live in the light of Allah's words." That simple statement pierced deeper than any book ever could. As they traveled, Sheikh Yunus did not teach Harith through structured lessons, but through conversation, storytelling, and observing the world. "Look at the farmer," he once said, pointing to an old man sowing seeds in the field. "He plants without knowing what will grow, but he still does his part. That is what you must do. Seek knowledge sincerely and leave the outcome to Allah." When they reached the great city of Basra, known in that era as a thriving center of scholarship and trade, Harith was awestruck. The tall minarets, the bustling streets, and the libraries filled with scrolls and ink all felt like a dream. But Harith did not lose himself in the glamour. His heart stayed humble, for he knew that even in the presence of great scholars, his journey had only just begun. Sheikh Yunus introduced him to an old friend, Imam Malik ibn Rayyan, respected teacher of hadith and fiqh, who had studied under some of the earliest successors of the Prophet's companions. The Imam tested Harith's manners first, before his knowledge. He watched how he greeted others, how he waited patiently in the gathering without interrupting, and how he cleaned his place before sitting. Only after observing his adab did the Imam agree to teach him. Manners, he said, are the gate through which knowledge enters. In Basra, Harith attended circles of learning by day, and spent his nights revising notes and praying in the quiet hours before Fajr. Sometimes he went to sleep hungry. Sometimes he sold his only cloak to buy ink. But he never once asked for more than he needed. He believed that every hardship on this path was a gift, a polishing of his soul by the will of Allah. It was in Basra that Harith truly began to see the deeper purpose of knowledge. Not to be praised, not to argue, and not to be known, but to serve, to purify the heart, and to live in the light of divine guidance. And as he sat under candlelight, writing down the sayings of the Prophet from the mouth of his teachers, his heart would whisper quietly, Ya Allah, make this knowledge a light for me, not a burden. Let it benefit others, not just myself. And let me remain a student, even when others call me a teacher. Time in Basra unfolded like pages in a sacred book, each day bringing new knowledge, new challenges, and new reflections. Harith had now been in the city for nearly 3 years, studying under several respected scholars. He had memorized hundreds of hadiths, mastered the principles of Arabic grammar, and begun to write his own brief commentaries. Yet he never allowed his accomplishments to rise above his humility. He still swept the masjid floor after classes ended. He still shared bread with the gatekeeper when food was scarce. And he still walked with his head bowed when elders passed by. But as his understanding deepened, so too did his recognition among fellow students. Whispers began to travel. That is the orphan boy from the village, who outshines even the wealthiest pupils. People admired his speech, his memory, his sincerity. Invitations came for him to join gatherings in more elite homes, where wealthy patrons offered support in exchange for private lessons or scholarly opinions. It was the kind of opportunity that many dreamed of: recognition, ease, and comfort. But for Harith, this became his next trial. One day, a wealthy merchant invited him to his grand house to teach his sons and dine with him. The home was lavish: marble floors, golden lanterns, and servants at every corner. Harith entered, sat quietly, and answered the boy's questions about jurisprudence and Quran. The merchant, impressed, offered him a stipend and a place to stay. "You deserve to live in ease, young man," he said, placing a bag of gold in front of him. "Enough of sleeping on cold floors and walking dusty roads. Let us help you live as you should." For a moment, Harith was tempted. Not out of greed, but out of weariness. The memory of walking for days, of going to sleep hungry, of shivering during long winter nights. But then he remembered the words of Sheikh Yunus: "A scholar's strength lies not in how much he owns, but in what he is willing to leave behind for the sake of truth." With a gentle smile, Harith thanked the merchant and returned the gold. "I am grateful," he said, "but I fear ease will steal the sincerity of my search. I am not yet strong enough to accept honor without falling into pride." Word of his refusal spread, and while some praised him, others began to question his choices. "He is too rigid," they whispered. "He turns down what could help him." Yet Harith remained steadfast. He continued teaching, learning, and walking the path of knowledge with simplicity. For him, the goal was not to be praised, but to please Allah and to follow in the footsteps of the Prophet, who lived humbly, though all of Arabia knew his name. One evening, as he sat near the courtyard of the masjid, copying a rare manuscript by candlelight, an old man approached. "I heard what you did," the man said, "and I remembered my teacher's words. True knowledge makes a man bend, not boast. The more he learns, the smaller he becomes in his own eyes." Harith looked up and nodded. "Then I hope to keep learning until I disappear completely." That night, as stars shimmered over Basra's rooftops and the call to Isha echoed through the air, Heareth prayed not for fame or wealth, but for purity of heart, strength to endure, and sincerity that would never fade. It was a morning like any other, the streets of Basra slowly waking to the rhythm of life. With shopkeepers lifting the shutters of their stalls and the scent of freshly baked bread floating through the air, Harith sat on the veranda of the masjid, carefully transcribing an ancient manuscript onto parchment, the ink on his fingers staining the edges of his sleeves. The air was still cool, and birds fluttered across the rooftops as he worked in peaceful silence. Suddenly, an elderly man approached with a small satchel. His robe was worn, but his eyes were sharp. "Are you Harith ibn Saul?" the man asked, holding out a sealed scroll. "This letter was entrusted to me by a traveler from your village. He asked me to deliver it only to your hands." Harith, startled but composed, took the letter. The seal was familiar. It bore the modest stamp of the village elder, Abu Zaid, the same man who had once scolded him as a boy for skipping chores to listen to traveling scholars. Harith opened the scroll slowly, and as his eyes moved across the page, his breath caught. The letter spoke of the village, of its struggles, of how the small madrasa, where he had first memorized Surah Al-Fatiha under a flickering oil lamp, had fallen into disrepair. The teacher who had once taught him had grown ill. There were no scholars left, and the children wandered, lost in play with no guidance. "They speak your name with hope," the letter read. "Not because of your fame, but because they believe you will return." Harith's hands trembled as he folded the scroll. A quiet ache stirred in his chest. He had come so far, learned so much. And yet, what good was knowledge if it did not serve those who had raised him? That night, as he prayed in solitude, his thoughts were filled not with the great libraries of Basra or the fame he had gained, but with the dusty road that led back to his village, to the people who had once watched him walk, barefoot with a torn satchel and dreams too big for his age. He remembered the old mosque where he had whispered his first supplications, the widow who shared dates with him during Ramadan, the carpenter who let him sit by the fire in winter. They were not learned, but they were sincere, and they had given him more than he had ever repaid. The next morning, Harith sought permission from his teachers. "Knowledge," he said humbly, "is a trust, and I feel that trust pulling me home." His teachers, though saddened, saw the resolve in his heart. "Then go, and let your knowledge be a lantern for those still walking in the dark," one of them said, as Harith packed his few belongings, some scrolls, a copy of the Quran, and the worn robe of his student days. The city that had once felt like a dream now seemed like a chapter closing. He left with no fanfare, no announcement, just the soft steps of a student returning home, not to be praised, but to serve. The journey back was long, but Harith traveled with peace in his heart. He stopped in towns along the way, offering lessons freely to young boys sitting beneath trees. He shared stories with elders, discussed hadith with wandering travelers, and prayed in quiet masjids that few ever noticed. And with each step, he felt the weight of his knowledge becoming not a crown, but a responsibility. By the time he reached the edge of his village, his beard had grown fuller, his face carried the wisdom of years, and yet his eyes still held the quiet hope of the orphan who had once dreamed under the stars. As Harith stepped onto the familiar dirt path that led into his childhood village, a wave of emotions washed over him. Memories wrapped in the scent of dust-date palms, swaying gently in the wind, and the low hum of distant voices echoing from the marketplace. The sun hovered above the horizon, casting a golden hue across the rooftops made of sun-baked clay. The village had not changed much since the day he left, though now it looked smaller somehow, not in size, but in spirit as if it had aged in his absence. He passed by the well where he once fetched water as a boy, his reflection now that of a man changed by knowledge, experience, and prayer. Children ran barefoot through the narrow streets, their laughter carefree, though their eyes flickered with curiosity as they glanced at the traveler in a worn robe. A few elders, bent with age and time, paused from their afternoon tea under the shade of an olive tree and squinted toward him. It was the baker's son now, a young man himself, who first recognized him. "Is that Hadith ibn Saul?" he whispered. Others turned, one by one, eyes widening. Whispers grew louder. Some rushed forward. Others stood in silent disbelief, as if seeing a ghost from their past. Harith smiled gently, bowed his head, and greeted them all with a peaceful "Assalamu alaikum," his voice warm and soft. They welcomed him with open arms and tearful eyes, not because he was now a known scholar, but because he was one of their own, an orphaned boy who had left quietly and returned as a man of learning and humility. The village elder, Abu Zaid, though frail and leaning on a cane, stepped forward and embraced him with trembling hands. "You came back," he whispered. "You truly came back." That evening, as the village gathered in the courtyard of the old, crumbling madrasa, Harith stood before them. No podium, no titles, no lofty introductions. Just a simple mat beneath his feet and sincerity in his voice. He didn't speak of the grandeur of Basra, nor of the scholars he had studied under. He spoke of gratitude, of patience, of how even the smallest acts of kindness, like the neighbor who had once shared a meal with him, had been part of his journey. He told them how seeking knowledge was not just about reading books, but about transforming one's heart and serving others. He reminded them of the value of faith, of prayer, of treating others with gentleness and mercy. He recited verses from the Quran, his voice calm and measured, each word settling softly into the listeners' hearts like evening rain. That night, the villagers did not sleep early. Some stayed back to ask questions. Others simply sat in silence, feeling a warmth they hadn't known in years. And Harithi didn't seek rest either. He walked through the quiet alleys under the moonlight, stopping before the masjid where he had once memorized short surahs with a cracked wooden tablet in his hands. Now he knelt on its worn prayer mat, and tears rolled down his cheeks, not of sadness, but of deep, overwhelming peace. His return was not a triumph of fame, but of faith. He had come back to teach, yes, but also to serve, to listen, and to remind others that no matter how far one travels, the heart must always know the way home. The morning after Harith's return, a quiet hope stirred through the village like the scent of fresh bread at dawn. For the first time in years, the broken wooden gate of the old madrasa creaked open, letting sunlight spill across the cracked stone floor and dust-covered benches. Children peeked through its frame, unsure if they were allowed to enter. And then they saw him, Harith, sweeping the floor with a worn broom, humming a gentle tune of praise to his creator. Gone was the grandeur of the scholarly halls of Basra. This was no place of marble columns or echoing libraries. But in that small village, with a madrasa crumbling at its corners and ivy creeping across its walls, something greater was being built: hope, guidance, and knowledge. Villagers came forth slowly, offering what they could. A carpenter brought nails and timber. An elderly woman offered cushions she had stitched long ago. The blacksmith reforged hinges for the broken door. Even the youngest came with wide eyes and open hearts, offering help in sweeping, carrying, or just listening quietly. And Harith accepted it all with gratitude, never seeing himself above them, only beside them. He began teaching under the shade of an old fig tree in the courtyard, before the renovations were even complete. His words were gentle and clear, his tone never rushed. He began not with philosophy or complex legal matters, but with stories. Stories from the lives of prophets and pious people, of their patience in hardship and faith during trials. He reminded the children that every act of learning, whether memorizing a verse, asking a question, or even sweeping the madrasa, was an act of worship when done sincerely. Soon, the courtyard filled daily, not just with children, but with parents and elders who sat quietly behind the younger ones, soaking in the wisdom they hadn't heard in years. Harith didn't just teach from books, he taught from life. He showed how the prophet had lived with simplicity and kindness, how the companions had sought knowledge humbly, how intention turned every ordinary deed into something extraordinary. The madrasa, once forgotten and silent, now echoed with Quranic recitation, respectful questions, and the occasional burst of laughter when Harith shared a gentle joke to ease the minds of his students. Lanterns were lit in the evening, and villagers often gathered again after prayer to reflect on what they had learned. But what touched the people most was not his knowledge, it was his humility. Harith never claimed greatness. He would eat with the poor, serve food to his students, and often be the last to leave the madrasa, assuring the lamps were out and the doors locked. One evening, as he sat under the stars with a few students, one of the boys asked him, "Ustad Harith, how did you become so knowledgeable?" He smiled softly and replied, "By admitting that I know so little, and by never letting hardship make me bitter." That night, the villagers knew they weren't just rebuilding a school, they were reviving a legacy. A tradition of learning not tainted by arrogance or wealth, but rooted in truth, service, and the sincere love of Allah. As seasons passed, the once faded madrasa bloomed with life and knowledge. Children who once wandered aimlessly were now reading and writing, reciting the Quran with devotion, and memorizing the words of the wise. Farmers quoted Harith's gentle teachings in the fields. Merchants paused their trade to reflect on the ethics he so often spoke of: fair dealings, truthful speech, and compassion in commerce. The entire village, once quiet and tired, pulsed again with purpose. Yet, with growth came trials not of poverty, but of recognition. Word of Harith's efforts had spread beyond the hills and winding rivers that surrounded his humble home. Scholars from neighboring towns came to meet him, not expecting the young man they found sitting beneath a tree, surrounded by children, teaching with a stick and dust for a chalkboard. Many were humbled. Some were skeptical. A few were even envious. One day, an official from the city arrived, wealthy, well-robed, and carrying a scroll with a golden seal. He introduced himself with pride and requested that Harith accept a position at a renowned institution far from the village. "Your talents are wasted here," he said with a tight smile. "You could lecture before judges, serve in courts, receive gold, and be honored with titles." The villagers stood in silence, their hearts suddenly heavy. They knew this day would come. Harith listened politely, his head bowed, eyes thoughtful. He did not answer immediately, for he never made decisions in haste. That night he prayed long and deeply, asking Allah for clarity not for himself, but for the people he served. By morning, his decision was made. Standing before the gathered villagers and the visiting official, he spoke gently, "I am honored by the offer. But knowledge, when it leaves the people who need it most, loses its blessing. These children, these farmers, these mothers, they are my duty. They welcomed me when I was unknown, trusted me when I had nothing, and helped me rebuild what matters. I cannot trade that for gold or titles." There was silence, then a murmur, then tears. The official left, disappointed but not angry, for he too had seen the sincerity in Harith's eyes. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, the village lit small lamps. Throughout the madrasa, in celebration, not because Harith stayed, but because he reminded them of something greater than success, the beauty of being needed and the honor of serving without seeking reward. That night, a boy who once struggled to read stood before Harith and recited a full surah from memory. Harith's eyes welled with tears, not from pride, but from gratitude. For he knew that true recognition didn't come from palaces or courts, but from the quiet prayers of those whose lives were changed by love, by knowledge, and by truth. Years passed like pages fluttering gently in the breeze of time. The village, once a forgotten dot on the map, had become a quiet sanctuary of learning and character. Harith, now older and gentler in his voice and gait, remained as humble as he had been the day he first taught a child to read from a scrap of parchment. His beard had begun to gray, his steps slower, yet his mind and heart glowed brighter than ever, like a candle that, even near its end, burns with a steady and unwavering light. One afternoon, as the golden sun filtered through the tall date palms, Harith sat beneath his favorite tree, one that had shaded him when he first arrived. Around him sat a circle of young students, their eyes wide with curiosity. They didn't just come for knowledge, they came for warmth, for wisdom, for the way Horith spoke as if every word was a gift. He never raised his voice, he never claimed greatness. But in his quiet way, he lit flames of purpose in hearts that had once known only hunger and hardship. A visitor came that day, a scholar from a distant land. He had heard of Harith's madrasa, not through grand publications, but through the kind words of travelers and merchants. He had crossed rivers and deserts, not to test Harith, but to sit with him, to observe the miracle of someone who had built an empire of knowledge from dust and honesty. As the evening call to prayer echoed across the fields, Harith and the visiting scholar sat together. "You have built something great," the guest said softly. "And yet there is no name carved in stone, no books published in your name, no statues raised." Harith smiled gently, looking out at the children helping one another recite and write. "Names carved in stone can be forgotten," he said. "But when knowledge reaches a heart, when character is built with kindness, when someone walks away more honest than they were before, that is a legacy written where no time can erase it." That night, the stars stretched across the sky, quiet and eternal, like witnesses to a life well lived. Harith wrote one last note in his worn-out journal, not for fame, but for remembrance. It read, "I was once an orphan with no name, no guide, no strength. Allah gave me knowledge, gave me people, and gave me the strength to give it back. If any good came from me, let it be a light for others. And if I leave this world tonight, let them remember not my name, but the message I carried." He passed away in his sleep not long after peacefully, with a prayer on his lips. And in the generations that followed, his students became teachers, his teachings became traditions. And his life became a story told not with loud voices, but with quiet reverence. The poor orphan of yesterday had become a scholar whose legacy lived on not in books or monuments, but in the hearts he touched, in the lives he uplifted, and in the truth he never stopped believing in. In the heart of old Damascus, long before the noise of modern cities, there lived a quiet man named Yusuf. He was not a man of wealth, nor of fame, but one of simple routines and a heart that bore the weight of life with calm acceptance. He worked as a weaver in the market, spending his days threading cloth with tired hands and honest labor. On one chilly winter evening, as the sun dipped behind the stone roofs and the call to Maghrib prayer echoed gently through the narrow streets, Yusuf closed his small shop and began his walk home. As he passed a quieter alley behind the spice market, something on the ground caught his small leather pouch. Worn but carefully stitched, half hidden beneath a scattering of dry leaves. He bent to pick it up, curious. Inside, he found what seemed like a fortune: gold coins, a few rings, and a folded piece of parchment with a faded name scribbled in old ink. His heart paused. This was not an ordinary lost item. This was someone's trust, someone's wealth, perhaps their life savings. He looked around. No one was in sight. The streets were empty, the sky dimming fast. He stepped into the nearest lantern-lit shop and asked if anyone had reported a lost pouch. "No," they said. He went to the masjid, to the local market elders again. No one had come asking. Yusuf took the pouch home, placed it carefully in a wooden box, and made a silent promise that night. "I do not know who you are," he whispered as he sealed it shut, "but if I cannot return what is yours today, I will carry it with me until Allah gives me the chance." And so began a journey that would last not days or months, but 10 long years. The years that followed passed slowly for Yusuf, but he never let the weight of his promise grow lighter. Every morning, as he tied the simple cloth of his turban and opened the shutters of his modest weaving shop, he would glance toward the wooden box, resting on the highest shelf of his home, where the leather purse remained untouched. It was not hidden out of fear, nor kept for greed, but stored as one would protect a trust from the heavens. Yusuf continued to inquire from time to time, asking travelers, shopkeepers, and scholars if they had ever heard of someone who had lost such a pouch in the old Damascus market years ago. The name written on the worn parchment remained unreadable to most. Its ink now faded to the color of dry soil, yet Yusuf never discarded it. In those 10 years, Yusuf's life went through many changes. His hair grayed at the sides, and the pace of his work slowed. There were days when the price of food rose, when customers grew few, when storms kept buyers away. And hunger tapped gently at his door, but not once did he consider using even a single coin from that purse. It remained whole, sacred in his eyes. On nights when the world felt cold and unfair, when others around him spoke of shortcuts and clever tricks to gain wealth, Yusuf would sit by the flickering oil lamp and remind himself of something his mother once told him as a child. "Son, wealth earned through honesty carries blessings far greater than gold." In silence, he would hold the box in his lap, not to count its contents, but to renew the weight of his promise. He sometimes wondered about the man who had lost it. Was he alive? Did he search for it? Did he weep in despair? Or had he given up hope altogether? These questions never left Yusuf's heart, but he believed with all his soul that what is meant to be returned will find its way, even if it takes a decade or a lifetime. 10 years is a long time for a memory to survive, especially one that isn't tied to your own past. But Yusuf carried it like a quiet ember in his chest, never letting it dim. One crisp winter morning, the market was stirring slower than usual. A blanket of mist wrapped itself around the narrow lanes of the city, and the scent of cardamom tea wafted through the air. Yusuf stood beneath the awning of his small shop, rubbing his hands for warmth, when he saw a familiar old merchant setting up across from him, man who sold second-hand books and worn maps. Though Yusuf had seen him dozens of times over the years, something about this morning felt different. The old man shuffled out a small wooden crate filled with forgotten papers and oddments. Out of curiosity, and perhaps guided by something greater than chance, Yusuf crossed the lane and struck up a conversation, hoping to warm his hands and his thoughts in the company of words. As they spoke, the topic drifted to lost things, letters never delivered, treasures buried in dust, promises long delayed. The bookseller chuckled and said, "Some say the city keeps memories better than we do." He pulled out a yellowed note, barely legible, and smiled. "Found this tucked inside a Koran that was donated years ago." A man had written of losing a leather purse in the southern quarter of Damascus, pleading that if anyone found it, they return it to his name. It's foolish, I suppose, after all these years. But Yusuf's heart stopped. He asked gently, "May I see that paper?" The bookseller handed it over. Though much of the ink had faded, there was a single name etched on the bottom, Hakim ibn Salih. Yusuf felt the name echo through his soul like the call to prayer at dawn. That name had been scribbled on the parchment inside the very purse he had found a decade earlier. Time stood still. In that moment, Yusuf felt neither the cold of the air nor the noise of the market. It was as though the city, with all its chaos, had paused just for him. He held the paper like it was something sacred, something he had waited to see for 1,000 nights. The bookseller watched curiously, but Yusuf said nothing except, "Thank you," and returned to his shop, the old note now clutched in his trembling hand. Inside, he knelt before the wooden box, unwrapped the aged purse from its cloth, and laid the name beside it. After 10 long years, the first thread of the promise had begun to stitch itself into something real. Not because the world demanded it, but because the heart of an honest man had never let go. The following morning, Yusuf awoke before the dawn prayer, stirred by something far deeper than habit, an invisible pull toward a purpose long set aside. The worn purse lay on the small prayer mat beside him, wrapped once again in soft linen. But now it seemed to carry not only gold coins and a forgotten name, but a Kalinga trust. For 10 years, Yusuf had lived humbly, selling spices and cloth in the bustling corners of Damascus, offering honest weights and gentle words. Yet never had his heart felt so alive, so stirred by the quiet responsibility that now rested in his hands. After prayer, He sat beneath the soft light of the oil lamp and examined the purse again. The leather had grown stiffer with age, but inside it remained untouched coins engraved with the year of their minting. Folded parchment with faint ink and a single seal in wax, partially cracked. He opened the folded paper once more and traced the name Hakim ibn Salih. The city was vast, and 10 years could scatter a man like dust in the desert wind, but Yusuf knew what he must do. That day, he closed his stall earlier than usual, and with the purse safely tucked into a pouch beneath his cloak, he began walking through the city, first to the southern quarter, where the purse had originally been found. The neighborhood had changed. New shops stood where old ones had fallen, and the faces were unfamiliar. He began speaking to elders sitting at doorsteps, shopkeepers brushing dust from their awnings, and even the children playing with hoops of iron in the alleys. "Do you know a man," Yusuf would ask, "by the name of Hakim ibn Salih?" Some would pause, frown in thought, then shake their heads. Others pointed him toward older mosques or scholars' homes, where names and stories sometimes lingered longer than flesh. As the sun dipped low behind the minarets, Yusuf found himself in a part of the city where the walls bore ivy, and the air was heavy with the scent of old books and jasmine. He approached a small masjid where elders often gathered after asar there. He met an imam with a beard the color of snow and eyes that gleamed with quiet wisdom. "Hakim ibn Salih," Hakim repeated softly. "Yes, I remember a man by that name." Hakim was a merchant sonanist, quiet, kept mostly to himself. But it has been years since he was seen. Some say he left the city. Others say the imam paused. Others say he fell ill and moved north to live with relatives. Yusuf thanked him with deep respect, heart swelling with both hope and uncertainty. As he walked home in the golden hush of evening, the call to Maghrib echoed through the narrow streets, and Yusuf whispered to himself, "Ya Allah, guide me to him, if he yet lives, so I may return what is not mine." It was not only a purse he wished to return now, it was peace, a forgotten story, and the trust that time had almost swallowed. As the days gently passed, Yusuf's search became less of a mission and more of a daily devotion. Each morning he stepped out with renewed resolve, the purse carefully hidden beneath his outer garment. Close to his heart, not just in proximity, but in meaning. He began to frequent places where travelers rested, caravanserais filled with the earthy scent of horses, tea stalls buzzing with quiet conversations, and old libraries where scholars pored over ancient scrolls. He asked with humility and patience, never growing tired of the replies that led him nowhere. It was not failure that touched him, but the chance to meet people, to greet elders, to connect dots between lives once disconnected. One afternoon, after Jumu'ah prayer, Yusuf sat in a shaded corner of a public square, sipping warm water sweetened with honey and cardamom, when an old man approached. He was stooped with age, but his eyes held a sparkle of memory. "You ask about Hakim ibn Salih," he said, his voice rasping like dry parchment. Yusuf's heart stirred, and he leaned closer as the man continued. "Yes, I knew his father, a silversmith, good man. Hakim was but a boy when his father died. He grew into a man shaped by honesty, like yourself. After his shop burned in the great fire near the old market, he left Damascus. Some said he went to Homs, others Aleppo." The mention of Aleppo struck Yusuf like a warm gust of wind. Aleppo, the city of scholars, merchants, and whispered legacies. If a man of honor wished to start anew, it made sense. That night, Yusuf lay awake, staring at the roof beams of his small home, the oil lamp's glow flickering gently across the walls. His thoughts wandered through all he had heard. The journey north would be long, uncertain, and costly. But his heart was no longer heavy with doubt. It was light with purpose. With a prayer on his lips and the stars watching overhead, Yusuf made a quiet decision to leave his comfort behind and walk the path of Amana, the path of trust. In the soft hours before Fajr, he packed only what was needed: a woolen cloak for the cold, dry bread and olives for the road, a flask of water, and the small purse now kept within a silk wrap, clean and preserved. As the sun rose gently over the city, casting golden light on ancient stone, Yusuf bid farewell to the streets he knew so well and began walking northward. The road ahead was unknown, but in his heart he felt calm. Because sometimes the greatest journey is the one taken for the sake of a trust left unfulfilled and a soul that still believes in returning what never belonged to him in the first place. The journey to Aleppo was not a matter of days, but of patient weeks. Stretched across sun-baked paths, winding hills, and towns where Yusuf was but a passing stranger. Each morning he rose before the first blush of dawn, performing his ablution under cold stars and whispering his Fajr prayer, while the world still lay hushed in sleep. The road beneath his feet was uneven and dusty, but his steps were steady, as if drawn by a purpose greater than himself. In the silence of travel, Yusuf found a kind of worship that required no words, only persistence, trust, and silent gratitude. He met fellow travelers along the way, a kind old shepherd who shared his flatbread under the olive trees, a mother carrying her sick child to the next village in search of herbs, and a scholar who recited stories of past sages during the long evening hours. With each person, Yusuf offered kindness and kept the secret of the little silk-wrapped purse tucked safely in his satchel. Not once did he speak of it. Not once did he boast of his purpose. His intention was not for admiration, but for completion of an amana, a trust between hearts, watched over by the one who sees all. At times, Yusuf wondered if the man he sought was even alive. 10 years was a long time. People move, cities change, names are forgotten. But each time such thoughts crept in, Yusuf would pause, place his hand gently over the purse, and say softly to himself, "Amana does not expire with time." Truth is not measured by what is easy. On a dusky evening when the horizon turned the color of rust and pomegranate, the high stone walls of Aleppo came into view, rising like a promise through the haze. The scent of spices drifted through the cooling wind, and the voices of children echoed from courtyards within. Yusuf's heart swelled not with triumph, but with prayer, a prayer that after all this time, the man he sought would be here, that the trust he carried would finally reach its rightful owner. And even if it didn't, even if the purse was never claimed, he knew that he had honored the path of sincerity. For in this long road filled with hardship and hope, he had already found what most men never do: the peace of a heart unburdened by regret and the joy of carrying truth even when no one else is watching. The city of Aleppo welcomed Yusuf not with celebration, but with the quiet stir of its daily rhythm. Merchants calling out over crates of dates and figs, children chasing each other through alleyways lined with centuries-old stone, and the scent of cardamom and rosewater drifting from bakeries as flatbreads puffed in old ovens. But to Yusuf, it felt like walking into a living memory. It was here, a decade ago, that a brief encounter had unknowingly carved itself into the fabric of his life. Somewhere amidst the color and noise, the owner of that little silk purse had once stood, perhaps bartering over saffron, or sitting in prayer at the mosque, or laughing with his companions in the shade of a fig tree. Now Yusuf, older and worn by the miles, walked those same cobbled paths, holding tightly to the hope that Allah would guide him to the man he sought. He asked around gently, without drawing attention, "Do you know a merchant by this name?" He would inquire, showing the small folded parchment with the name he remembered from long ago. Some would squint and shake their heads. Others would scratch their beards and point him toward other districts. A few smiled and offered tea instead of answers, for in this ancient city, stories mattered more than directions. Days turned into a week. Still, Yusuf roamed patiently. Each evening he sat by the fountain in the old quarter, the silk pouch still tucked within his satchel, untouched, though the coins inside had tempted him many times over the years, especially during hunger and hardship. But he had resisted. Not for reward, not for fear, but for the quiet dignity of amana, of trust kept in silence, of a heart that answered only to its Lord. He remembered his mother's words now, whispered into his ears when he was a boy with scuffed feet and dusty cheeks. When you are lost in a world of noise, listen to your heart in Suj, it never lies. That night, under the soft glow of oil lamps and the call of the night at hand, Yusuf prayed with such stillness that even the winds seemed to pause. He asked not for ease, nor for thanks. He simply prayed, "O Allah, let this trust find its way, or let me be content that I tried." For in his heart he knew the journey had already changed him, taught him the meaning of true wealth, the kind that neither rusts nor fades, the kind carried not in purses, but in hearts that choose honesty, even when no one else would know. It was on a quiet morning, just after the city's first prayer, when Yusuf found himself standing before a modest spice shop nestled in a narrow lane behind the old mosque, a place he had nearly overlooked. The name etched above the wooden frame matched the one he had searched for tirelessly these past 10 days. Heart pounding softly in his chest, he stepped inside, where an elderly man with gentle eyes and a beard streaked with white was carefully scooping saffron into silk sachets. Yusuf hesitated, unsure how to begin. With trembling hands, he reached into his satchel and drew out the weathered pouch. Still intact, still sealed with the fine cord that had held it closed a decade ago. "Forgive me," he said softly, "but many years ago, I found this near the old caravan road, lost in the dust. I searched then, but no one claimed it. And I've come back now, to return what never belonged to me." The old man took the pouch in his hands, and as his fingers ran over its fabric, something shifted in his expression. Silence fell between them, heavy and sacred. His eyes welled with tears, not because of the gold inside, but because of the memory it unlocked. He whispered, almost to himself, "I thought it was gone forever. My son had sewn this with his own hands, and I kept it close always, until the day it vanished while I traveled back from the desert." His voice cracked with emotion. "For years, I thought someone had stolen it. But it was never theft, it was trust. Preserved by someone I never met, until today." He reached across the small wooden counter and held Yusuf's hand in both of his palms, warm and trembling. "You have not returned gold," he said, voice thick with reverence. "You have returned my faith in men." Yusuf said nothing, for what could he say in a moment so complete? They stood there for a long while, the morning sun casting golden light through the open window. Two strangers joined by a single act of honesty, an act that had defied time, temptation, and distance. It was in that moment that Yusuf understood something profound. Sometimes Allah delays our rewards not to test our patience, but to perfect the moment of return, to turn it into something far greater than we imagined. And as he stepped out of the shop, he felt lighter than he had in years, not because he had let go of something, but because he had carried it faithfully for so long. In the weeks that followed, word of Yusuf's act spread quietly through the alleyways and markets of the city, not like a loud trumpet, but like the gentle passing of a lantern from one soul to another. People who had once rushed through life, busy with trade and worry, paused a little more to greet their neighbors, to ask after the old and the forgotten, to reflect on what they had once dismissed as insignificant. The merchant, now older and slower in his step, often told the story to young apprentices who visited his shop, not to boast, but to remind them of what true wealth really was. "Gold can vanish," he would say, running a hand over the old pouch now kept in a wooden box on the shelf. "But an honest heart leaves a mark no thief can erase." As for Yusuf, he did not stay long in the city. After offering a quiet farewell and refusing any reward, he returned to his village with peace in his chest and a humble smile. That seemed to speak volumes to those around him. He never told the tale himself, for he believed that honesty loses its light when carried like a flag. Instead, he lived simply, teaching orphans the value of truth, kindness, and trust. values he had once learned in hunger and hardship, and which had grown stronger through a decade-long test. Years passed, and one day, long after Yusuf had returned to his Creator, an old man from the village would tell a group of curious boys about the traveler who walked for 10 years with someone else's gold in his bag, and not once let it feel like his own. And in that quiet retelling, around a modest fire, the story lived on, not as a legend of greatness, but as a whisper of goodness. It reminded those who heard it that even in a noisy world chasing riches and praise, a single act of truth carried silently and returned with grace could change more than one life. It could revive a forgotten value, mend a broken faith, and plant a seed of light for generations to come.